The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The air was thick with anticipation as the judge, a distinguished man in his 50s, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. His gavel rested heavily on the polished wooden bench, a symbol of authority and finality. But today, authority felt like an illusion. Seated at the witness stand was a boy no older than 15. His hands were clenched into small fists, his knuckles white as he held back emotions that threatened to spill over. His deep brown eyes, a mirror of pain and betrayal, locked onto the judge's own, freezing him in place. "You abandoned me." The words cut through the courtroom like a blade. A collective gasp echoed among the audience. Attorneys, spectators, and even the bailiff were momentarily stunned into silence. Judge Thomas Marshall felt his heart seize in his chest. The words hit him harder than he could have anticipated. His mind scrambled to find an answer, a response, an explanation. But none came, because deep down, he knew the boy was telling the truth. A murmur ran through the courtroom, hushed whispers of confusion and curiosity. The prosecution attorney, a woman with sharp features and an even sharper mind, looked between the judge and the boy, her expression unreadable. The defense attorney sat back, folding his arms across his chest as if this was a show he had been expecting all along. The boy took a shaky breath and continued. "You looked me in the eyes just like this and walked away." Judge Marshall swallowed. He had ruled on hundreds of cases, sent hardened criminals to prison, granted mercy when he saw fit. But never, not once, had he been at the center of a case like this. "Son," he started, his voice faltering. I'm not your son," the boy snapped. His voice was laced with years of resentment, of pain too heavy for someone his age to carry. "I was once, but you left me." The weight of his words settled over the room like a storm cloud, and Judge Marshall knew there was no escaping it. Not this time. Part 2, The Past Unveiled. The courtroom had never felt this suffocating. Every eye was on Judge Marshall, waiting for him to respond. But how could he? How could he begin to explain what had been buried for over a decade? The boy, Nathan, his Nathan, sat rigid in his chair, his face etched with emotions he could barely contain. It had been 10 years since the last time they had seen each other, and yet the judge could still see the little boy he had once held in his arms. The boy he had promised to protect. The boy he had ultimately failed. The prosecution attorney finally broke the silence. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but firm, "perhaps you'd like to explain what the defendant means." Marshall inhaled sharply. He glanced at Nathan, then at the attorney. He knew he had no choice. The truth was coming out, whether he wanted it to or not. "I knew Nathan when he was very young," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned to the courtroom, trying to maintain his composure. "I was in a relationship with his mother." A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people nodded as if they had suspected something along those lines. Others looked genuinely surprised. "Go on," the prosecution attorney pressed. Marshall closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady himself. "We were young. I was just beginning my career in law, and she was struggling. Nathan was 3 years old when she came to me, desperate. She needed help." Nathan let out a bitter chuckle. "And you turned her away." Marshall's head snapped up, his jaw tightening. "Number I tried to help. But what?" Nathan interrupted, his voice rising. "You told her you couldn't handle it? That you had bigger things to focus on?" The courtroom was completely still, everyone hanging on to Nathan's words. "My mom begged you," Nathan continued, his voice shaking. "She begged you to be there, and you chose your career over us." Marshall felt a lump form in his throat. "It wasn't that simple, wasn't it?" Nathan's eyes burned with anger and sorrow. "Because I remember watching her cry at night. I remember seeing eviction notices on our door. I remember being hungry because she had to skip meals to make sure I had something to eat." Marshall's fingers gripped the edges of the bench. The weight of his past choices was now crushing him under its full force. "I was scared," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I wasn't ready to be a father, and by the time I realized what I had done, it was too late." Nathan's eyes glistened, but he refused to let the tears fall. "You were never there for me," he whispered. And now you sit on that bench, judging people for their actions, while you abandoned your own flesh and blood. The courtroom held its breath. Even the stenographer had stopped typing. Judge Marshall had spent his life upholding the law, but in this moment, he had never felt more guilty. Part 3. The verdict of the heart. Nathan exhaled, his body trembling. He had carried this pain for so long, and now, finally, he was confronting the man who had left him. But even as the anger coursed through his veins, he wasn't sure what he wanted from this moment. The prosecution attorney cleared her throat. "Your Honor, given this new revelation, I'd like to motion for a recess." Marshall raised a hand, silencing her. "No." His voice was steady, despite the storm raging inside him. He looked directly at Nathan. "What do you want from me?" Nathan blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I can't undo the past," Marshall continued, his voice thick with regret. "I can't go back and be there when you needed me. But if there's anything I can do now, tell me." Nathan was silent. For so long he had dreamed of this confrontation, of telling Judge Thomas Marshall exactly what he had done. But now, looking at the man who had given him life, yet left him to struggle, he didn't know what to say. Finally, he whispered, "I don't know." Marshall nodded. "Then let's figure it out together." For the first time, Nathan saw something genuine in his father's eyes. Regret, guilt, but also hope. The courtroom, once filled with whispers and gasps, now sat in stunned silence. Nathan took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He wasn't ready to forgive, but maybe, just maybe, he was ready to start healing.